Now, there's much talk, but very little understanding about the role of the rabbis in Judaism. And in the next minutes, we're going to attempt to provide some much needed background to understand what authority the rabbis actually possess and what difference they make in the practice of Judaism. Classical Judaism is known to have two Torahs: the Bible, or the written Torah authored by God, and the oral law authored by the rabbis. Both play a key role in the understanding and the actual observance of Judaism. So now then, how does it work exactly? And isn't it strange for any people to rely upon an oral work for their day-to-day religious practice? And here's another question. From where did the rabbis derive their authority to compose the oral law? And why isn't it enough to have a written Bible? Why do Jews even need an oral Torah? And finally, the oral law consists primarily of two well-known works called the Mishnah, compiled by Judah the Prince in about the year 200 of the Common Era, and the Talmud in 500 CE. Both are very much written works, so why are they called the oral law? Let's start with the very concept of having an oral law. Is that unique to the Jews? Interestingly enough, having an oral tradition is certainly not unique to Judaism at all. In fact, virtually all societies and cultures rely upon oral representations for their cultural practices, their history, and traditions. Here's an example. Remember the name Betsy Ross? She's been credited with having sewn the first American flag. And how do we know this to be true? Well, History.com reports that in 1870, Betsy Ross Claypool's grandson, whose name was William Canby, when he was already an elderly person, presented the family tale to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And that's it. We have no reason to doubt the veracity of Canby's claim. But that's the way history and tradition works. It depends often entirely upon someone's oral representation. But you know what? It goes far deeper than that. I'm going to draw a letter in the air and ask you to name that letter. Yes, it's the letter A. Now, why did you call it that? Because that's what your teacher taught you way back in preschool, no doubt. Now let's look at a similar story from the Talmud. Tractate Shabbos, page 31a. A heathen once came and asked Hillel, "How many Torahs do you have?" He answered, "Two, one a written Torah and the other an oral Torah." The man responded, "The written one I believe in, but not the oral. Convert me on the condition that you teach me only the written Torah." Hillel accepted him. On the first day they studied, Hillel taught him the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Daled. The next day he taught him the Hebrew alphabet, but in reverse order. The man asked him, "Hey, yesterday you taught it to me the other way around." He answered him, "If you relied on what I taught you yesterday regarding the letters, you should rely also upon me today for the oral law." Hillel is making the exact point that in fact we rely almost entirely on oral traditions and culture, not only to know our letters, but to pronounce all of our words and to understand what they mean and how to use the words and expressions in contemporary writing and conversation. But with the Torah, it's even more than that. In fact, we find large portions of the written Jewish Torah could not possibly have been observed at all were it not for the oral law. Let me preface an example I'm going to give you by sharing with you that according to the greatest medieval scholars, including Maimonides, keeping Shabbat is the single most central commandment of all of the Torah, in that it flies in the face of those who believed the universe to have been a constant, meaning that the universe always was. It had no beginning and no creator. It's then quite interesting that there is universal acceptance of the 7-day week, in that it has no other source other than that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. In any case, the rabbis tell us that celebrating Shabbat is testimony that God created the universe, and violating Shabbat in antiquity was a capital offense for this reason. Interestingly, the Torah repeats the law to keep Shabbat under the penalty of death multiple times. But what it actually prohibits on Shabbat literally is melacha, or work. Okay, so what constitutes work? Well, the answer to that important question is only provided by the rabbis of the Talmud, not the Torah. Without dissenting opinion, they specify that there are 39 categories of work or malacha, with literally many hundreds of derivative prohibited actions, capital offenses all. So for the hundreds of years between when the law was given at Sinai and the time the Talmud came into existence, how was malacha, or work, defined? Let's try to imagine the scene of Moses teaching God's words to the minions. "Don't work on the Sabbath," he thundered. "And what if we do?" asked the wise guy. "You'll be put to death," says Moses with a flourish. Okay, we'll observe the Sabbath. What exactly is it that we can't do? "I have no idea," says Moses, "but I know for sure if you do it, you'll die." Obviously, when the Torah was given to the Jews, it already came with, or was accompanied with, an oral explanation that gave the details. Although those details weren't committed to writing, they were nonetheless carefully taught by teachers to students and by parents to children for about 1,000 years. Here's another great example. The Torah specifically commands us to have certain biblical passages bound to our arms and placed upon our heads. Now, just about every Jew with the most basic knowledge of Judaism knows this to refer to tefillin. However, the Torah never uses the phrase tefillin, which is only to be found in the oral law. It simply tells us to bind something on our arms and totofos between our eyes without even giving us a smidgen of additional information. So what did the people do at that time? Did everybody interpret this on their own? And there were thousands of different tefillin created of different sizes, shapes, and colors? In fact, we have quite a number of ancient tefillin that were unearthed over the last many years, and they all sport the same specs. They're black, square on top, oblong on the bottom. They're made of hardened leather, use straps to tie them on our hands and heads, and they contain the same texts inscribed on the same types of scrolls inside the boxes. Obviously, the instructions were delivered at the same time as the command to don those tefillin. Moses said, "In the name of God, don tefillin." The Jews said, "How?" And Moses obviously provided them with the answers and the details. These examples are not exceptions. In fact, it could be safely said that the vast majority of details regarding how to keep kosher, observe the holidays, get married, build a family, mourn our loved ones, and even pray are only stated in the Torah as concepts without any details about the how. The laws we possess regarding ritual slaughter of animals are voluminous and complex, to say the least. But the Torah actually says in Deuteronomy, "In the event you would like to eat meat, you must prepare it in the way that I have commanded." Now the problem is that nowhere else in the Torah does it so much as mention the laws of ritual slaughter. It doesn't make much sense to have the written law requiring ritual slaughter without an already extant body of oral information so you can actually eat that steak. And so it fell to the rabbis to faithfully collect these oral instructions and teach them to the people, not merely as volunteers, but as fully mandated by the written Torah to teach the law, decide the law based upon Torah, judge the people, enforce the law, and enact new laws as necessary to help observe the Torah. In fact, the rabbis maintain a very disciplined adherence to a constitutional process to settle disputes and enact new laws. The Torah states in Leviticus, "Ushmartem es mishmarti," "Therefore shall you keep or watch over my charge." This is intended to caution the court regarding the fact that they must enact or legislate new laws to protect the laws of the Torah. And regarding judging and enforcing the law of the Torah, it states in Deuteronomy, in a portion that will be read in synagogues this very Shabbat. In Deuteronomy it says, "Judges and officers shall you make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God gives you, and they shall judge the nation with true justice." They're mandated by Torah to perform these functions. We should note that the Torah is replete with new cases for which Moses could not provide rulings. Those of you who are somewhat familiar, there's the story about the wood gatherer, the one who blasphemed against God, the concept of the Pesach Sheni, the daughters of Tzalafchad, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, ask your local rabbi. It might be a very good launch pad to start learning the Torah. So Moses was presented with situations he had never seen before, so he had to try and derive the answers from the written Torah. And when he could not, he went back to God for additional information. The Jews required answers, and Moses was obligated to research those answers and provide them with the ruling in these cases. So here's an important question. Why does all this vital knowledge reside in oral form? And how did it come to finally be recorded? Now, the Jews are unique as a wandering yet eternal people, which begs the question, how have we in fact maintained our unique identity for thousands of years of exile under the worst of conditions? And the answer is through our Bible, the Torah, which scholars have called the portable homeland of the Jewish people. And now if every detail of every law were included in the written Torah, it would be extremely unwieldy and not very portable at all. The written Torah, in effect, became the cliff notes of religious practice, and the oral law provides the details. Now, another reason for having an oral law is that the immutable laws of Torah must transcend the ages and contemporary case law. For example, the laws of property damage, as they appear in the Torah, involve what would happen if your bull destroyed your neighbor's vegetable patch. Now, how would you apply that to when your F-150 pickup truck rammed someone else's Prius? If all property damage were recorded and reduced to writing at that ancient time, they wouldn't seem to remotely pertain or apply just a generation or two further down the road. Instead, we prefer to explain the operative concepts behind the example given in the Torah orally from teacher to students, so that Judaism remains an eternally living and breathing religion, where the immutable concepts come alive as they are taught from teacher to student, and they can then be practiced faithfully in each new generation with its own case history. And with the exception of many scholars and teachers who kept their notes and journals privately, the oral law remained oral for thousands of years, during which time the all-important rabbi-student relationship was the paramount central feature of Jewish life. So now, how did we get to the point where we have a very much written 60-volume Talmud right behind me, and thousands of other publications of Jewish law that today comprise what is still ironically called the oral law? Well, when it became obvious that Jews were going to be exiled and the rabbi-student bond would be disrupted, the rabbis exercised a great leniency and in a departure from tradition recorded the oral law. First, in a compilation called the Mishnah, as we said before, in about the year 200 CE, and then again in 500 CE with a far more detailed record of rabbinic discussions of the Mishnah called the Talmud, and many other far-reaching oral teachings. Since that time, many thousands of oral works have been published, and they all have the status of what we call Torah Shebal Peh, which translates into the oral Torah. Not surprisingly, the charge has been made, and it is indeed a fact, that the Talmud contains thousands of disputes between the various Talmudic sages going back 1,000 years. So what's served by recording disagreements? And it's not like there are just a few disputes here and there. When you open to just any page of the Talmud, the rabbis seem almost like they have to argue about everything. However, there's another charge, which is made at the same time. People complain that the rabbis argue over the most minute and trivial hair-splitting details. Okay, well, which is it? Are they arguing over everything or only over the tiniest of details? This kind of reminds me of the time that my late mother, who was a gourmet chef, returned from visiting Israel. "How was your flight, Ma?" I asked her, and she couldn't stop praising the El Al pilots for their smooth flying. But, she added, that airline food was beyond awful. Poison it was. And she said, pausing to further reflect upon the experience, such small portions. What a contradiction. If you hate the food, you should be thankful they come in small portions. Well, this same complaint applies to the criticism of the Talmud. Well, which one is it? Are they always fighting or only over the most insignificant differences? Well, it turns out that regarding the everyday practice of Judaism, there are few disputes at all, and an overwhelming 99% of agreement. However, due to the advent of new cases never before considered, and the small percentage of inevitable human error and forgetfulness, a disagreement may arise on how to apply Jewish law in a given situation. However, the very fact that the rabbis argue stubbornly over seemingly insignificant things teaches us a great deal about the integrity of the rabbis and the integrity of the oral Torah. What they don't argue over, what is not recorded as an argument in the Talmud, means that they universally agree upon that. So let me give you an example through which we will actually study a bit of Talmud ourselves. The Talmud in Tractate Kedushin opens with the laws pertaining to Jewish marriage and its ceremony. It is accepted without dispute that a Jewish marriage, in order to occur, must have a ceremony. In order for there to be a Jewish marriage, there must be a ceremony. People just can't get married in what's called a common law marriage. It is further required that the ceremony be witnessed by two qualified individuals of character. It also requires that the groom has to obligate himself contractually to his bride via a written and duly executed ketubah or marriage contract. Furthermore, in order to be a valid marriage, it requires that the groom give a gift of value to the bride. But how much value is required? Here we define a dispute between the houses of Shammai and the house of Hillel. The former believes that the gift must possess the value of, in modern terms, at least $1. But the latter says it can be the equivalent of a penny. Now, how practical is this dispute when, as a groom, you'd be in big trouble for even attempting to give your beloved bride a ring worth a penny or even $1? But for the last thousands of years, this dispute remains on the books of the Talmud. Does this seem to you to be a power grab by the rabbis, as some would claim? It's their effort to control the Jewish people, or are they serious about establishing what was God's intention, even on a minute level? To answer this question, let's play devil's advocate here and imagine a group of less than honorable rabbis, in reality power grabbers, meeting at an oral law convention to fill in the seeming missing or incomplete information in the written Torah that we discussed earlier. And they will claim afterwards that their decisions on these topics was the will of God, of course. Okay, here goes. Amid overflowing platters of gefilte fish and chopped liver, the evening's chairman arises and asks, "Gentlemen, we have never discussed of what shape the tefillin should be. Any ideas?" The chair recognizes the gentleman from Jericho. "I believe the tops of the tefillin should be square and the bottoms should be oblong." Do we have a motion to second? All in favor say aye, and at that point it passes unanimously, because as we know, there is no dispute in the oral law regarding the shape of the tefillin. "And now, gentlemen, what about its color?" Well, they decide unanimously on black. The fabric? No problems here either. Hardened leather. The text inside the boxes? Unanimous agreement on 4 different texts from the Torah. Next topic. How many forbidden categories of activity on Shabbat will define the Torah's word of work? Malacha. 39, thunders the crowd in unison. "Yes," comments the chair, 39 is a nice round number. Unanimous. How to slaughter an animal so that it's kosher? After all, the Torah left that one out too. 12,421 detailed laws? Sounds about right. No argument on that. What about, is there a heaven, an afterlife, and purgatory? Moses seemed to have left that one out of the Torah too. Unanimous in the affirmative. Everyone says sure. "Now, gentlemen," the chairman continues, "the last item on the agenda is regarding the value of the gift in the wedding ceremony." Rabbi Shammai stands up and confidently says, $1. At which point pandemonium breaks out on the convention floor. Rabbi Hillel yells, "Hey, I was with you on heaven. I was with you on hell. And I didn't say boo about the 39 prohibited categories of work on the Sabbath. But this is where I put my foot down. Absolutely not. The value should be a penny." Others soon join the fray, and cries of "dollar" and "penny," "dollar," "penny," "dollar," and "penny" are heard over the voice of the chair, who pleads with the delegates to compromise at 50 cents and call it a day, but to no avail. So did those rabbis argue about the gift because they were seeking power? Is it a decision that involves power? Or is it rather a sincere search for truth regarding the intent of the Creator? Judaism does not compromise on truth. In fact, we refuse to sacrifice our truth for the sake of power. Here's a case in point. How many political parties are there in the United States of America? Well, basically 2. How many in Canada? 4. A fractious people. England, 5. Italy, wow, they're even more fractious. 9 major political parties. Then we come to Israel, where there are 17 significant political parties, including 3 communist parties. What is going on here? The United States has 300 million people, and it only needs 2 parties to pretty much contain all points of view. Israel, a tiny country of some, 8 million people, has 17 political parties. Most nations are okay sacrificing their truths for political power. The Jews are stubbornly opinionated to the point where we will not compromise on our truths for the sake of power. In the Torah itself, God calls Jews a stiff-necked people with good reason. And so it's quite ignorant to say, well, sure, the rabbis just got together and made all this up and agreed on everything except for these little details. The truth is that the power of the rabbis in the oral law, if they had any power, is in their relentless pursuit of truth rather than political expediency, so that even the smallest matters of Jewish thought and practice accurately reflect the will of the Almighty. Oh, and there's another significant benefit to be had by recording disputes in the Talmud. defining and quantifying the precise areas of dispute and disagreement serves to narrow and contain the breach of the unknown and the forgotten details of the oral law. In our case, it is forever decided that if a groom provided a gift of less than a penny, both the houses of Shammai and Hillel would agree it is not a valid ceremony. And if it was worth more than $1, all agree that it is valid. So the exact area of doubt has been defined for posterity, and we can in fact move on. Perhaps this is what the Talmud refers to in Masechet Brachot. That's the very first volume of the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Eliezer said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, Talmidei Chachamim increase peace in the world. Okay, how? By defining, recording, and thereby limiting the areas of dispute, limiting the areas of uncertainty in the practice of Judaism. And now I'd like to end with this amazing story. In almost every hellish ghetto during the German Nazi genocide of World War II, a story similar to this repeated itself. The accursed SS would ask all the Jews in a particular ghetto to assemble outside the local main synagogue and force them to watch as they set it ablaze. And despite the machine guns trained on the synagogue entrance, some Jew couldn't hold himself back, broke from the crowd, and ran into the burning edifice, emerging moments later carrying a Torah scroll that he was attempting to save from the flames. The Nazis were ready for him and unleashed a furious salvo of bullets that pierced his body in 100 places. Inconceivably, as he fell dead, there would always be another undeterred Jew who would emerge from the crowd, grab the Torah in a futile attempt to save it. And more often than not, there'd be a few more braving certain death to save that Torah. Are we even permitted to give up our lives to save a Torah scroll? Ironically, our rabbis in the Talmud tell us that we are not. But fighting to preserve the Torah and its laws seems to be imprinted on our Jewish DNA. Whether it's the ghetto Jews sacrificing themselves to protect the written word of God, or the rabbis who courageously battle on to go on record to contain the chasm of disagreement and stubbornly refuse to compromise on even a mere 50 cents. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'd really appreciate your feedback, which will always be cherished. Have a great night.